That is the most kavanah I've heard in Amen for a long time. It is my absolute zchus and pleasure to be here with you this morning at the legendary Ohel Sarah Amen group, which is truly renowned internationally. I look forward to the biography or the historical work which will write up this extraordinary place, which has been the dissemination of Torah in a way which I guess few could have ever imagined. It is really a particular honor for me to be a part of this tremendous project, which began a number of years ago with a difficult beginning. But as all things that we Jews do, we rescue from the challenge, from the difficult, we make great positive things. And this is clearly a prime example of such a thing. First and foremost, I want to make sure that the words of Torah that we say today are for the zchus of the neshama, for Sarah Yuta Aleh Shalom Bas Ephraim Mendel Vidina. I want to thank our hosts, the Martins, for this exceptional opportunity. I do, of course, want to thank also Rebbetzin Fuchs for all her efforts. That she is just an amazing woman, and of course the sponsors of today's program as well. As you know, this is the month of Mar Cheshvan, or Cheshvan, if you will, and we add the additional letters Mem Resh at the beginning. There is a debate exactly where those letters come from. Is the month really Mar Cheshvan, or is the month just Cheshvan with these additional prefix of the Mem and the Resh? Some actually suggest that the Mem and the Resh, Mar, stands for bitter Cheshvan, which many of you may have heard. Why is Cheshvan called bitter? Because after all these holidays, we have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, we have a month which literally has no holidays whatsoever. So we're bitter about that. Some say it refers to Mar like Mr. Cheshvan, like the Hebrew word Mar, to give it a little kavod because it has nothing else going on in the month of Cheshvan. I want to suggest a different explanation, a very different explanation, that in fact Mar Cheshvan is an important month, an extremely important month following up on the holidays. As you know, we just completed our series of holidays, and one may erroneously believe that the holiday of Sukkot is actually the beginning of the holidays because we just started our school year. So Sukkot is at the beginning of the year. In fact, Sukkot is not the beginning of the holidays. Sukkot is the final holiday of the Shalosh Regalim. It is the culmination of the Shalosh Regalim. But it is a culmination in a very important way. And let me explain very briefly before we begin our discussion today. The holidays begin with Pesach. Then they go to Shavuos, then they go to Sukkot. Each one has an agricultural association. Does anyone know what the agricultural association of Shavuos is? Anybody remember? Chag HaKatzir, the holiday where we cut the wheat. Does anyone remember what the agricultural association is of Sukkot? Chag HaAsif. Chag HaAsif. What is Asif? Asif is we take the wheat, we gather it, we bring it into the home. What then is Pesach? So if you think about it, here's the very brief agricultural evolution. Pesach, if we're harvesting the wheat and we're bringing it into our homes, we obviously had to have planted a seed at some stage. When was that seed planted? That seed was planted with Pesach. What is Pesach? Pesach is the seed of Klal Yisrael. It is the first time where Klal Yisrael becomes a nation. The nation is planted, taken out of Mitzrayim into Eretz Yisrael, and the seed is planted. What happens with Shavuos? With Shavuos, that seed which HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us and was planted only by the grace of God, and really no human intervention whatsoever, the wheat grows in the ground, and we cut that wheat. That is Chag HaKatzir. What is the significance of Pesach? Pesach is the holiday of Torah Shebichsav. Of Shavuos, rather. Shavuos is the holiday of Torah Shebichsav. That is the holiday where we celebrate the giving of the Torah. Did we do anything to receive the Torah? We did nothing whatsoever. We are simply passive recipients of the Torah. What happens then subsequently in Sukkot? Sukkot is Chag HaAsif. The seed was planted in Pesach. The wheat was grown until the holiday of Shavuos. The wheat was cut. What do we do now on Sukkot? Sukkot, we bring that wheat, which God gave us, which God bestowed upon us, we bring it into our homes. When we bring it into our homes, that's when we instill human creativity in the entire process. So now we have wheat. What do we do with that wheat? We bake challah. You just heard a beautiful bracha of challah. We bake cakes. We make beautiful things, beautiful creative things. Those creative things require human intervention. Sukkot really is the representation of Torah Shebaal Peh, of the human intervention in the process of the Torah. And how is that even reflected in the holiday? It so happens, not by coincidence, that a tremendous number of the aspects of the celebration of Sukkot are Torah Shebaal Peh, are entirely human transmission and human intervention into understanding of the Torah. So, for example, what fruit is an esrog? How do we know what fruit an esrog is? Torah Shebaal Peh. Entirely Torah Shebaal Peh. How do we know that we should have Nisu Hamayim, the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the only holiday in the entire year where water is poured on the Mizbeach, a tremendous celebration in the Beis HaMikdash, only through Torah Shebaal Peh? How do we know we should celebrate Simchas Torah on the final day of the Chag? The entire celebration of Simchas Torah, the completing of the Torah, is entirely Torah Shebaal Peh. It's written nowhere in the Torah whatsoever. So you see, the holiday of Sukkot is the culmination of the entire process. From the seed that was planted to the wheat that was cut, and we're bringing it now into our homes with the Torah Shebaal Peh. This is really the entire fulfillment of the Torah. It's the human creativity. Now when we complete that process on Sukkot, what's the next month? Next month is Cheshvan. What are we now to do that we've been given the Torah and the opportunity for human creativity? We are to use it now. So I would suggest that the Mem Reish is a Rashi Tevos for Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu is the ultimate, the consummate transmitter of the Torah Shebaal Peh. And we today are going to fulfill that Torah Shebaal Peh. We're going to start this month of Cheshvan by addressing what is one of the most fascinating areas of Torah Shebaal Peh today, and if I would submit the entire history of the Jewish people. And that is the way we address modern technology and modern science. And what we are going to do today is do that through one of the most extraordinary figures in the link from Moshe Rabbeinu to today, and that's through the man or the personality known as Rav Eliyashiv. How many people here have heard of the name Rav Eliyashiv, just for my knowledge? And it is particularly relevant and important for us to discuss this figure because his daughter, Rebbetzin Kanievsky, now I don't know the history of the main groups in general. She is known to be responsible. She started it. She literally started the main groups. So it is extremely relevant and important for us to discuss it in this particular forum. What I would like to do with you today is I would like to share with you, first of all, a brief history of an extraordinary man, a man who was a link in this transmission from Moshe Rabbeinu until today, and then share with you some fascinating chapters in contemporary medicine to see how a giant of Torah addresses very complex issues. First, the history of the man. Rav Eliyashiv came from Lithuania with his parents in 1922 to the state of Israel. But he was born after 17 years of his parents not having any children, and he was born and was the only child. When they came to Israel, he distinguished himself as a Torah scholar to such an extent that the person that arranged his shidduch was the chief rabbi then, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook. And he suggested that he marry the daughter of Rav Aryeh Levine. Rav Aryeh Levine, known as a tzaddik in our time. He married the daughter of Rav Aryeh Levine. He then had a number of children, both boys and girls. A number of his daughters married great Talmudic scholars, including his daughter who married Rav Kanievsky. He had a daughter married Rav Zilberstein, who's also a great Torah scholar. And he established himself as literally the Gadol Hador. The Gadol Hador, on whose doorstep everyone who had a major halachic problem across the globe would come to his house, which includes, obviously, our particular topic of medicine and halacha. This man, who was born after 17 years of a childless marriage and an only child, by the time he died, he saw the beginning of a 6th generation from him, with descendants totaling close to 1,000 people. That is the man, Rav Eliyashiv. Let us begin. We will begin and both end with a fascinating story about the power of Rav Eliyashiv. And the first story that we will begin with actually is somewhat related to his own genesis, if you will. And that is the story of a couple who did not have a child for 15 years. And they were happily married. However, their intense desire to fulfill the mitzvah of Puravu led them to divorce despite the fact that they were happily married. Shortly after the divorce, they realized that the wife had actually become pregnant. Now, in a normal situation, the husband can remarry his wife. There's one exception. This man happened to be a Kohen. Could not remarry his wife. He immediately went to Rav Kanievsky. Rav Kanievsky said, I can't help you. You have to go to my father-in-law, Rav Eliyashiv. He went to Rav Eliyashiv. Rav Eliyashiv says to him, the halacha is very clear. A Kohen cannot remarry his wife. I suggest you go to the kosel and you pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what the man did. He immediately went to the kosel. He prayed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, crying his eyes out. And a man sees him crying and approaches him and says, I see you crying so intently. What are you crying for? He says the whole story. He tells him the whole story. He went to Rav Eliyashiv, etc. The man says, do you have a father? He says, yes, I do. He says, I suggest you go speak to him. He said, my father? My father's in a nursing home in the United States. He's unfortunately hasn't been communicative for months to years. He says, I suggest you go see your father. And he turns around and he walks away. The man thinks to himself, Rav Eliyashiv told me to come to the kosel. This man's telling me to go to my father. I'm going to my father. He takes the next plane to the United States. He arrives at the nursing station where his father is residing. And the nurse says to him, listen, I appreciate you coming here, but don't be disappointed. Your father hasn't spoken for a very long time. He goes into the room, he sits down next to his father, and he tells his father the entire story. His father, eyes focused upon him very intently, after a very long pause, turns to his son and says, very quietly but very clearly, I want you to know that your mother and I were products of the Holocaust. When we married after the war, we could not have children. We adopted you. You are not a Kohen. This man realized the power of Rav Eliyashiv, the only one who could have been the vehicle to accomplish this Yeshua for this particular individual, and he remarried his wife, and Baruch Hashem, everything worked out very happily. Let us now turn to some of the fascinating chapters in medicine that came to the doorstep of Rav Eliyashiv. Oh, very good. So I just received a very important note that Rav David Weinberger received a personal haskama from Rav Eliyashiv for the inception and the creation of this Amen group. So I should have read Hashgacha, because it's Hashgacha that I'm speaking about it, and everything is Hashgacha. So you see the power of Rav Eliyashiv, by the way, who was nifter about a year and a half ago. We just had his first yortzeit a few months ago. You see the power of a tzaddik even after life. So you see there's obviously a tremendous Hashgacha involved. So let us begin a discussion of some of the fascinating chapters that came to the doorstep of Rav Eliyashiv. Now, some of these are major issues. Some of them are not as major issues, but you have to realize that in the field of medicine, many of these issues are literally life and death. And you can approach your local rabbi here in the 5 towns, wherever you may live, but the odds are, issues of such gravity, issues of such magnitude, your local rabbi simply is not capable, doesn't have the shoulders to be able to paskin. So who are they going to turn to? The Gadol Hador. They're going to turn to Rav Eliyashiv. So the first case that we bring is on page 2. Is the following. A new technology developed a number of years ago. And Shari Tzedek Hospital in Israel wanted to avail themselves of this new technology. This technology was called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or doctors love to use acronyms, called PGD. How many people here are familiar with the with what PGD is? Okay, say about 5% of you are familiar with what PGD is. Let me explain to you very briefly what this absolutely extraordinary technology is and what the potential halachic ramifications are that they needed to address with Rav Eliyashiv. Today, let me actually bring it to you through the following. How many people here are familiar with a novel called My Sister's Keeper? Here's the story of My Sister's Keeper, and through this story, we will approach the issue of PGD. My Sister's Keeper is a situation where a family had a child that suffered from a particular blood condition. The only treatment for that blood condition was a bone marrow transplant. But no one was available that had the particular bone marrow for that specific child. So if you go back 20 years ago, here's what would have happened, and this did happen 20 years ago. A family had a child with this particular blood condition, needed a bone marrow transplant, so what do? They conceived a child naturally in the hopes that that child would be a match to the existing child. There's a 1 in 4 chance that that would be the case, and as Hashgacha would have it, that child turned out to be a match. And they performed a bone marrow transplant, and the child survived. They just had a 20-year anniversary, and you might have seen it on the media. Fast forward now to the 21st century, now you don't have to leave things up to chance. Here's what is occurring now, today. You can take the reproductive seed of the man, the reproductive seed of the woman, fertilize it in the laboratory. Now, if you look on the front page, actually you have it here on page 2 also. You can fertilize it in the laboratory, and when the embryo starts to grow to the 8-cell stage, what you're seeing here is a magnification of the human embryo, and on the bottom, at 6 o'clock, is a pipette, which is beginning to extract 1 cell from the human embryo. You can extract 1 cell from the human embryo. That cell can be sent to the laboratory to determine the genetics of that embryo. All the genetics of that embryo. Everything which is knowable at that particular time in history. So what couples have been doing now, and the most recent one is within the last year, there's a couple that had a child who suffered from a particular blood condition. They went to the specialists, fertilized a number of embryos. They determined with PGD the exact embryo which is a match for their child. They implanted that into the woman. Then in the delivery room, they harvested the umbilical cord blood, and in the umbilical cord blood are stem cells. Those stem cells were used to regenerate an entire bone marrow in the child, and the child is completely cured. And this is not science fiction. This is the current state of medicine. This is one use of PGD. There are other uses of PGD. You can use PGD to determine gender, right? So here would be a potential halachic use of PGD. And I ask you if you think this is an appropriate use. You have a couple that just got married. They're in their early 20s. They want to fulfill the mitzvah of pidyon haben. So they say, why leave it up to chance? Let's go to the laboratory. We'll do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. We'll make sure we get a boy. And Makayim mitzvah of pidyon haben. Everybody okay with that? No. How about this one? You have a couple that has 9 boys. And they want to fulfill a mitzvah of puravu. Are we okay with that? Yes. Now let us move across the spectrum. Now let us entertain its usage in more serious conditions. Now one of the conditions which has afflicted the Jewish community, there are certain genetic diseases which have afflicted the Jewish community. One of them is a disease which many of us know about. Baruch Hashem, haven't seen too much of it recently. And that is the condition called Tay-Sachs disease. How many people have ever seen a case of Tay-Sachs disease? So a number of hands go up, Baruch Hashem, a relatively small percentage. Now, if we would have been speaking here 20 years ago, and I would have asked how many people have seen a case of Tay-Sachs disease, every hand would have gone up. And many of you would have known people or personal family members whose very high incidence of Tay-Sachs 20, 30 years ago, before the gene was testable. Now we have, Baruch Hashem, the ability to test for it, and many people test for it even before they get married. They use an organization called Dor Yesharim, etc. But now a couple that lived 20 years ago that found out after they were married that they were both carriers for this particular condition, and they wanted to have a child free of Tay-Sachs, what was their option? They didn't really have an option before. The only option they would have is to conceive naturally, and then to potentially test the fetus in utero to determine if that fetus was afflicted with Tay-Sachs disease. And then, if that determination was made, then you'd have the very challenging, difficult shaila, what do you do with those results? Are you allowed to perform an abortion? Are you not allowed to perform an abortion in that particular scenario? And the Gedolim, the great sages of that generation, of Moshe Feinstein Zatzal and Tzitz Eliezer, of Eliezer Waldenberg Zatzal, they were at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Rav Moshe famously said it was, even in that scenario, it was prohibited to perform an abortion. And the Tzitz Eliezer was the other opposite end of the spectrum. He said not only was it okay to perform an abortion, but you could perform an abortion until the 7th month of gestation. So those are the two polar extremes in that scenario. But the landscape has changed. Because today, if a couple are both carriers for a particular genetic condition, and we're using as our example Tay-Sachs disease, they can avail themselves of this technology. They can go to the laboratory, fertilize a number of embryos. They can determine exactly which embryo is afflicted with Tay-Sachs and not implant that embryo. Do you think that's a permissible use?
Yes.
Now, what are the halachic issues? Why would it even be a problem to do this? Of course, it's a remarkable technology. What would be the halachic problem? So there are a number of potential halachic issues. One, the procurement of the zera, both from the male and the female, have a number of halachic issues, not such a simple matter. It's been discussed extensively for couples who suffer from infertility. And there are many heterim to do it under the context of infertility. In this case, the couple doesn't suffer from infertility. They can have children naturally. They were choosing to do this supernatural or artificial means of conception just to have a child who's not afflicted with disease, but not because they're suffering from infertility. Perhaps it won't be justified to do it in this scenario. The other question is, you have, for our discussion, say 10 embryos sitting in the laboratory. You've determined which embryo you're going to implant. What do you do with the rest? What's the halachic status of these? So this is the major halachic issue. So for this, when Shari Tzedek wanted to open up the PGD lab, they approached Rav Eliyashiv to ask him all these questions. And Rav Eliyashiv said that to produce a child who is absent of a particular disease, in these cases Tay-Sachs disease, it is absolutely halachically permissible to utilize this procedure of PGD. What do you do with the excess embryos? Are they considered human life? So according to the Catholic Church, for example, the Catholic Church maintains that the embryos in the laboratory are considered human life, to such an extent that they are lobbying for people to carry these embryos. There are hundreds of thousands of embryos frozen in the laboratory. The Catholic Church is looking for hundreds of thousands of surrogate mothers to carry these embryos. Does Halacha feel the same way? The answer is no. Halacha does not consider the fertilized embryo in the laboratory to have the status of life. As such, Rav Eliyashiv paskin that it was permitted, and you do not have to implant these embryos. You can even potentially discard these embryos. They don't have the status of human life. They still have a chashivus. They still have an importance. They're still a derivative of the zera of the man and the woman. But human life, they do not possess. So that was his.
Can they give them to other couples?
So excellent question. Can you donate the excess embryos to other couples? So most poskim would say no, because there are potential halachic ramifications. And actually we're going to discuss an issue related in a few moments, the issue of maternity. Who's the halachic mother of these embryos? So there is a related issue which we will discuss. But Shari Tzedek has indeed employed this. And if you look in the upper right-hand side, I apologize, the print is small, but it tells you a list of diseases for which they use this PGD. But they have an ethics committee to be able to determine exactly which cases they can use it for and which cases they can't. They have had 2 cases, to my knowledge, similar to the case of My Sister's Keeper, where couples have approached them to use the PGD to create a child for the purpose of serving as a bone marrow or stem cell donor. In both cases have been approved by the committee. But the potential application for this is profound. So you have to limit from a halachic perspective when you can use it, because we said to use it for the young couple to create a child for pidyon ben, obviously not possible. To use it, your other children are not so sports-minded. Maybe you want to have a child, who's more adept at sports. Maybe we'll use genetic manipulation to create a child who's smarter, who's brighter, who's taller. All these kinds of things. You can imagine the potential abuses here. Yes.
How about if a mother's older and she, before the implant, to check to see if the child has Down syndrome rather than implanting and then in the fifth month seeing after the anesthesia?
So excellent question. Using PGD for Down syndrome. Now I'm going to share with you a very, very interesting psak from Eretz Yisrael about Down syndrome. Very controversial psak. And the psak was the following. There was a concern that women are continuing to have children. There was a fear by many women that if they continue to have children in later years, that they might have children with Down syndrome. So the question was, on balance, and then you'll hear this, you'll see how controversial this is. On balance, if many members of the community are not having children, they're faced with an option. I don't want to have children because I'm worried with Down syndrome. So Rav said the following suggestion. Now, normally, we don't allow abortion in these kinds of cases. But if, on aggregate, you have thousands of women that are refraining from having any children, if we allow women to conceive and give the option to determine whether their child has Down syndrome, and if it does, then to allow for an abortion, it might actually increase, on aggregate, the number of people who are having children. Very, very controversial psak. Because generally, the same people that talked about abortions, to abort for a child who has Down syndrome is a major debate. A child who has Down syndrome can lead a very functional life. We don't know. I mean, a child who has Tay-Sachs, and this is where it becomes complex. You have to really analyze each disease on its own merit. So a child with Tay-Sachs disease, as your husband, the neurologist, would know fully well, is a disease of very severe debility at an extremely young age and almost 100% mortality. But there are many diseases for which people can live incredibly long lives and lead productive lives. Are we going to say that these people should not have been born? It's a complex issue, and it's a theological issue. Now, using PGD for Down syndrome is a debate because PGD is not a genetic condition, meaning it's not inherited. Now, it is true that an older woman has a higher likelihood of developing Down syndrome, and it is true that PGD will be able to determine whether an embryo has this particular condition. But it is not a classic inherited disease that they received from somebody else. So if a woman has already had one or two, there are inherited forms of Down syndrome, which is a different aspect. I don't want to go too far off on this tangent, but it's a very complex issue about the use of PGD for Down syndrome. So that's the kind of thing you should ask a particular psak. Yes?
Just briefly, with the question of this analogy with the Down syndrome, did anyone consider the possibility of changing the way of thinking of the community to accept and welcome the children with Down syndrome?
Fantastic comment. Did anyone suggest maybe instead of focusing on that dimension, we should focus on the community being more accepting of children with disabilities? And our community, I think, is doing that. And I think camps are doing that. You have Camp Kaylee, Camp Hass, which I think is a movement on that front. Unfortunately, it's not going to apply to everybody. So I think you have to work on both fronts.
All the questions to the end.
Okay, Rebbetzin Fuchs, she's still protocolling me. We'll finish one chapter, I think, for today, and we'll let us. What time do we have to finish, by the way, Rebbetzin?
Whenever you're done.
Let's turn to page 3. Let's turn to page 3, and we'll go to the related. We'll go to the related issue. Issue related to PGD. Baruch Hashem, we live in an age where the treatment for infertility has advanced in extraordinary fashions beyond wildest dreams. 3 of the 4 imahos suffered from infertility, 75%. If you look at the Rosh Hashanah davening, there is tremendous focus in the Rosh Hashanah davening on infertility. The Haftorahs, if you read the Piyutim, which are very difficult to read in Hebrew, if you read them in English, you'll see like half of them focus on infertility. Had the imahos, had Sarah, Rivka, and Rachel lived today, they could have gone to the reproductive specialist and had their infertility treated. One of the treatments for infertility, now Sarah, for example, one of the reasons, according to one pshat, Sarah Imenu, the reason why she suffered from infertility is because she had no womb. Said she had no base vlad, no womb, according to one approach. What would she have done today? She still had ovaries, she still had eggs. She would have hired a surrogate. She would have taken her eggs, used Avram Avinu's Zera Avraham, and they would have implanted it into, hopefully not Hagar, I don't know who they would have used at that time, maybe, but they would have implanted it into a surrogate. And so the question would be, in this scenario, who's the halachic mother? This is a major, major question. Very important question. To whom do you send a card on Mother's Day? Right? According to Hallmark, both mothers are considered the halachic mother. Both the genetic mother and the gestational mother. Here you have a cartoon about all the different potential mothers: biological mother, working mother, surrogate mother, adoptive mother. All these kinds of things. Unwed mother, unfit mother, all these kinds of things. So, but the major issue is the following. If you have this scenario where one of the partners in the process is not Jewish, so let's say Sarah Imenu, obviously this is before Judaism per se, but let's say, bring it to the modern era. You have a Jewish couple that wants to hire a surrogate. But the surrogates, you can't find a Jewish surrogate. So you have to use a non-Jewish surrogate. Is the child Jewish or not? Does the child need a conversion when it's born? Now, I'm not going to answer these questions. There are many, many complex questions. And there are organizations, there's one organization in Eretz Yisrael called PUA, for anybody who has any questions about any aspects of infertility. It's literally an organization with many rabbanim and affiliated physicians that deals with all the halachic issues related to all forms of infertility treatment. But the question which has plagued the modern generation is the halachic status of the mother. Who's the mother? So they asked Eliyashiv, who's considered the mother? No, there was no consensus. Literally the entire gamut of Piskei Halacha on this, from no halachic mother to one halachic mother to both mothers considered the halachic mother. But they asked Eliyashiv, and in his answer, and I'll just read briefly on page 3, he wrote, we'll read in the middle section, the larger print, Maran Shlita hisbir psikaso sheyitziraso shel adam mishaveh mizaro shel ha'av v'habeitzit shel ha'isha. That the origin of conception for the child is the reproductive seed of the man and the reproductive seed of the woman. V'harechem shel ha'isha, and the womb of the woman mitpateach umimenu nolad v'yotzi lavir ha'olam eno kaveas hayachas. The womb, which serves basically as an incubator, does not generate filial relationships, does not create maternity. They said if it did, skip to line 7, im tvatzer efsharut shenitan yelakachat beitzit ulashtila berechem behema sheholides ha'ubar hima behema tikba et hayachas or yichus shel ha'ubar. If it was possible to take an embryo and plant it in a cow, do you want to tell me that the cow is going to be the mother? Is it possible for your mother-in-law to be a cow? I'm the only man over here, so I know I get stoned for that one. It's okay. So he paskined. Like I said, there are many people who paskin on this. There is no consensus today whatsoever. But he paskined that in his eyes, the genetic mother would be considered the halachic mother. Now there are still halachic issues and many different variations and permutations. Did you have a question? There are many different issues, variations, and permutations on this. Again, this is not a place where we're going to paskin these. There are, Baruch Hashem, many, many couples in the Jewish community that are availing themselves of all these different technologies. And there are poskim that deal with these in every case scenario. And Baruch Hashem, many, many children in our community have been conceived with this technology. And in fact, in Eretz Yisrael now, 4% of the population are conceived through assisted reproduction. So and it's increasing. So it is an incredible part, and it's being molid banim ubnei banim into Klal Yisrael. So it's a tremendous thing, but it needs to be used with halachic guidance. The next one, cosmetic surgery. Cosmetic surgery has expanded exponentially in the 20th and 21st centuries. And if you look at the graphs of the usage of cosmetic surgery, it's literally a spike curve which goes up, it's going up to the sky. And there have been many new developments, from Botox to every imaginable surgery. So the question is, that was asked of Rav Eliyashiv was the following. It's interesting because Rav Ovadia Yosef actually asked Rav Eliyashiv this particular question. That was the context. And he wrote, "Ha'im muter la'adam la'asos nituach plasti k'dei li'afot et panav al yidei hardama klalit." Is one allowed to undergo cosmetic surgery to enhance their facial appearance, which would necessitate a general anesthesia? So when they asked this question 20, 30 years ago, maybe actually it's 40 years ago, they asked it of Moshe Feinstein. They asked the question about a young woman who wanted a rhinoplasty. She wanted a nose job, it was called. And she had such damaged self-image. She literally couldn't go out with a boy. She couldn't leave the house. She couldn't look in the mirror. It's profoundly psychologically impacting her. So he paskined that even though there were risks associated with it, it would be permitted for the woman to undergo the surgery. On the other side, by the way, the Tzitz Eliezer, they often were at odds with each other, with Moshe and the Tzitz Eliezer, said that it's an affront to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to perform such a surgery. Said that God created us a certain way. You're basically saying we're created in the image of God. So if you're changing your appearance, in essence, you're saying, I'm offended by the way God created me. So he paskin no. But as it has evolved over the decades, most people agree with Rav Moshe. And also the danger and the risk part, which was a big factor in the halachic decision making, has come down significantly, precipitously. So they asked Rav Eliyashiv. Rav Eliyashiv said, back those days, general anesthesia was a major factor of saying you shouldn't perform any operations because general anesthesia is a risk. Today, literally millions of people have undergone general anesthesia. Now, it is true that general anesthesia is still a risk, and you will invariably hear these tragic cases of a young girl who goes in for a cosmetic procedure, as a birthday present from their parents, and doesn't leave the room. These things happen. But the totality of statistics reflect that those things happen incredibly small amount, very, very small statistically, to such an extent that poskim don't consider them an impediment to be able to perform these procedures. So Eliyashiv actually said it would be permitted for her to undergo the procedure, even under general anesthesia, because general anesthesia for prolonged surgeries can be risky, but for the shorter surgeries is not as risky. So that he paskined, that's the way he paskined. Now let's turn, for the last few minutes, let's turn to page 5 and 6. One of the areas which was also a life and death issue, which came to the table of Rav Eliyashiv, is the issue of organ donation. Now, there are many aspects of organ donation. We could spend an entire session or 10 or 12 on the issue of organ donation, but just to highlight some of the fascinating questions that came to him regarding this issue. One of them actually is an interesting book, which you see the cover page on the upper right-hand side, called Klayot Yoatzot, or Klayos Yoatzos, which is an allusion to a Talmudic phrase about the kidneys. The kidneys advise, the Talmud in Brachos teaches us. And this entire book is the following case. This is a real case. There was a member of Knesset who needed a kidney donation. He went to his physician. His physician suggested that he get a live organ donation, that it would be better for him. So he had 5 sons. He came home, and when he came home, one of his sons was at home. And he told his son, I just came back from the doctor. The doctor told me I need a kidney transplant. The son said, great. He ran outside, immediately went to Hadassah Hospital, got himself tested. By the time he finished his testing, came back home, his brothers had returned from their day's work, their day's learning. And they said, oh, Chaim, where were you today? He goes, oh, I went to the doctor. I got tested. I'm going to be a kidney donor for Abba. So they said, you're going to be a kidney donor for Abba. We want to be a kidney donor for Abba. What makes you think that you get the schus of being the donor? So they fought tooth and nail, or kidney in this case, in order to be able to determine who's going to be the donor. And the Bechor said, I'm a Bechor. I get rights over here. I not only have obligations, I get rights too. So they literally could not figure out who's going to get the opportunity to donate. So they went to Rav Eliyashiv. And this entire book is that psak. Now what's interesting is it was published without the name of the posek. It was published anonymously. I only found out many years later that it was Rav Eliyashiv of Paskin. Do you guys have any idea how you would Paskin such a thing? How are you going to decide?
We don't know the questions above. How can we do it? Well, are all of them going to be an exact match?
Good, excellent. So are they all, first you figure out if they're all a match, or who's the healthiest, right? Those are good thoughts.
Very rigorous testing.
So medical testing, first you do medical testing. One issue, yes?
have no problem with that. I have a type 1 diabetic child, she's 2 years old, she's 16 now, and really brittle diabetic. And it's always in the back of my mind that question. And I would give her, if she ever got to the leader in the future, I'd give her a kidney in a second. My husband would too. But I would never take a kidney from another one of my children, and I would never have a younger person give an older person a kidney. Because what happens if that child ends up needing a kidney? He can only live with one. He can only live with one. So to take it, I just have such an issue with an older person taking a kidney from a child. I think
Excellent point. But every individual is going to approach it differently. Now, you're approaching from a parent to a child. If you're the child and you have an opportunity to give to your parent, you might say, don't prevent me from giving to my parents. So your point is extremely well taken, and there's a very personal element to this, and admittedly a very emotional element to this, but every case has to be decided on its merits. Now the personal issues, the Rav isn't going to paskin. Those every family has to paskin. But the halachic issues, the Rav can paskin. So what did he paskin? He paskin the following. Said that interestingly, the first person who got himself self-tested has a halachic advantage. Why? Because of a halachic principle, which we wouldn't be expected to know, Kol hamaschil b'mitzvah omrim lo gemor. Once you begin the process of the performance of a mitzvah, we have an obligation to facilitate the completion of that mitzvah. But he also said, Eliyashiv, the Bechor has an advantage as well. So now he's left with the Bechor and the first tester. How are you going to decide between these two? So he did a lottery. How else are you going to decide? So he did a lottery, and the Bechor actually won the lottery. In this case, he really won the lottery. And he was able to be zocha to be a kidney donor. And he lived many healthy years afterwards in the Knesset. But one of the other areas, yes?
I had a bone marrow transplant. I had a bone marrow transplant. And Chasdei Hashem, I have 2 siblings, and they were both perfect matches.
Oh, wow.
And I have a brother and a sister, and they were also fighting over, they both wanted to be my donor. But the man is always chosen over the woman once she's given birth. So.
Oh, wow. Chasdei Hashem. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Zocha for many years of health and happiness with your beautiful children. The other issue that was presented to Eliyashiv is the following. We talk about organ donation, but unfortunately there aren't enough organs to supply all those who need donations. If you go right now, if you have your handheld devices, you go to unos.org, United Network of Organ Sharing, unos.org. It gives you an exact number of people in this country that are awaiting organs, 130,000, 140,000, I don't remember where we stand. That number keeps going up and down for a variety of different reasons. It goes up because people are needing. It goes down for 2 possible reasons. It goes down because Baruch Hashem someone got a transplant. It also goes down because maybe someone didn't get a transplant that needed a transplant. So one of the areas where the transplant community is trying to increase donation is to financially compensate people who are donating. Give them money. So right now it is illegal to pay somebody to serve as an organ donor in the United States. But what does Halacha have to say about it? Halacha has to say the following. But here was the context of the question that was asked of Eliyashiv. Eliyashiv, thanks so much.
Is this for any organs or just specific?
It's really for any organs.
But it's living.
Well, you can also receive compensation after death. So if you have a family that says, the family member that passed away, and they want to donate whatever organs, corneas, or if it's another complex issue which he paskin, if you want to donate hearts, livers, kidneys, depending on the scenario, and they say, well, only do it if you give us $10,000. Is it permitted to receive compensation? So there are different halachic issues between living and after death, interestingly. But look at the sociological issue. Look in this top of page 5. A halachic query directed of Yosef Shalom Eliyashiv illustrated the dire situation of ultra-Orthodox parents in a financial bind faced with meeting their children's wedding costs. A yeshiva student from Jerusalem who was about to marry his daughter, marry off his daughter, I guess, asked the distinguished Lithuanian rabbi whether he could sell a kidney in order to purchase an apartment for the young couple, and was naturally denied. What's interesting is he was naturally denied, but he was probably denied for sociological reasons. The halacha is, according to the overwhelming majority of poskim, in contradistinction to secular law, that it is permitted to receive compensation for donation. For sure for living donation. Because you've performed a tremendous mitzvah. We're not going to discuss the halachic issues now, but take my word for it, the majority of poskim say it is indeed permitted to receive compensation. Other issues, and we'll have 5 more minutes since I come. So other issues include the following. One of the complex issues of donation in China has come to the fore in the media here in the United States. And that's the realization that there are a number of people on death row in China, and magically, it just so happens that the executions happen to be timed just around the time people are coming into the country to receive organs. So there was a tremendous fear. Now Israelis, there's not that much transplantation that's happening in Israel, so a lot of Israelis actually go to other countries to receive transplants. Many of them come here to the United States. They used to go to Romania, they'd go to Belgium, to Turkey, and there's a lot of black market in these things also, which we're not going to talk about now. But Eliyashiv paskin very clearly, it was absolutely usher, would be tremendous chil Hashem for anybody to go to China to receive an organ because of the clear association of the possibility, at least, which they deny, but many of us realize is a false denial, that people are literally being killed for the sake of harvesting organs. So let us turn. So what did Eliyashiv know? Very, very briefly, and we'll skip to the last page for today. For us, will be page 6. But one of the major issues that relates to organ transplantation is the following. The majority of organs today are harvested from patients who are diagnosed with a particular condition called brain death, which means that the brain has stopped functioning, but the hearts can still continue to beat, and there can still be perfusion. The organs can still be living. The general Western world has accepted this definition as a legal definition of death and has allowed patients with this particular condition to donate their hearts, their livers, their lungs, their kidneys. The question over the last 20, 30 years has been, does Halacha accept this definition of death or not? If it doesn't accept this definition of death, then you obviously cannot harvest from this patient because you'd be killing them, and that would obviously be halachically prohibited. So Rav Eliyashiv was very clear about this, and he maintained that brain death was not considered halachic death. And the entire community that follows the psak of Rav Eliyashiv follows in that vein today, and they do not consider brain death to be halachic death, and therefore they would not serve as organ donors. There are many Gedolei HaPoskim who don't accept that psak and who accept brain death and allow for transplant, but his psak was as follows. Let us end with the following complex case as we move from the very beginning of life to the end of life. By the way, another, just to mention, does anyone know what that's a picture of in the upper right-hand side? In page 6? It's a Kohen. How do you know it's a Kohen? Who else would be sitting with a bag in an airplane? So it's a Kohen. So he paskin that, so without getting into that, but just fascinating case. When you fly, Kohanim, or even Bizman Hazeh, even today, are not allowed to defile themselves with exposure to a corpse, to a dead body. The tuma, the impurity, it can even convey impurity. It's called tumas ohel, which means flying over or walking over a mace, someone who's buried in the ground. The tuma rises up to the skies. So if you have a Kohen who's on an airplane who's flying over a cemetery, it could potentially be an issue. Now, what about the airplane itself? So there are many halachic issues about what is a chatzitza, what actually separates between the tuma and the individual. So the plane or the material of the plane may not be sufficient to do that. So the plastic it may actually do that if it's completely sealed. It's a complex issue. So that was that issue. Yeah. So that's for another time. But the final case for today. Right, so when you talk about the oxygen coming down, how are you going to get that through the plastic bag? Okay, these are questions. But the truth is, you only need to wear it when you're going over the cemetery. You don't need to wear it for the whole plane ride. So it's literally for 5 minutes. You just need to put it on for 5 minutes and you take it off. So the Kohen isn't sitting there for 12 hours with a plastic bag suffocating. So don't worry. So the last case of we started from the beginning of life, literally from life's inception. Now we're coming down to matters that relate towards the end of life. Rav Eliyashiv was asked the following question. You have a person who unfortunately knows that is a 90-year-old man and he knows, and he has a defibrillator in place. And now a defibrillator is a mechanism whereby if the heart beats irregularly, it'll shock. It'll deliver a shock. So just like we do with the paddles in the emergency department to shock somebody, it's an internal shock. It delivers an internal shock. A person says, I've lived a long life. I have many different illnesses. I really would rather let nature take its course. Do me a favor, doctor. Turn off the defibrillator. Turn it off. So that if my heart stops or my heart beats irregularly, let nature take its course. So they asked of Eliyashiv, can someone turn it off? Now, end-of-life issues is very complex. You are generally not allowed, so if someone's on a respirator, so there are halachic issues. You can't necessarily stop a respirator because a person will die immediately if you turn them off the respirator. But that's not the case here. This is only a device which may fire if the person has an abnormal heartbeat. It may never fire, ever. So one could make an argument that indeed it would be permitted to stop this defibrillator, to turn it off. But in fact, Rav Eliyashiv did not paskin that way. He paskin that because this device is an integral part of the body, even by the way, that the cardiologist could literally deactivate it with a magnet, not even touching the body, he said it is considered an act of potentially hastening the death of the individual if you turned it off. So he paskined that way, even though others may have paskined in a different way. So in conclusion, we've had the opportunity here very briefly to cover some fascinating chapters from literally the beginning of life and the end of life, continuing the tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu, continuing the tradition of Sukkot that we just left, of perpetuating the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Mirz Hashem, in this venue, this very venue, you should continue to be zocheh to perpetuate Torah Sheba'al Peh for many, many generations to come.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.